This lecture is on World War II from 1941 to 1945 and will concentrate on the US involvement in the war and the impact the war had on the American people. Historians consider World War II to be a watershed event. Now, watershed events are usually an event that will spark multiple other issues to come forward. And World War II in particular was a watershed event because it unleashed the civil rights movement, more concentration on women's rights, labor unions, and also the fact that atomic warfare becomes a possibility as a result of World War II. So those are some of the ways that we're going to be looking at how World War II was a watershed event and how the world was really transformed by this war in a way that we had never seen before this time. Franklin Delano Roosevelt concentrated early on these 4 freedoms that the US would be fighting for. And this Norman Rockwell painting of the 4 freedoms kind of hoped to give an ideological meaning to the war. The freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. While these things had been concentrated on during the New Deal to guarantee to Americans, FDR wanted to guarantee these to the world and told the American people that this war needed to be fought in order to guarantee these basic fundamental human rights to nations across the globe. But how did the US get involved? There was a lot of American reluctance. Many Americans didn't want to get involved in international affairs because of the legacy of World War I. And we see Congress favored isolationism also with the various neutrality acts. So in Europe, for nearly 2 years, Britain stood virtually alone in fighting Germany after the Nazis invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. By 1940, Hitler and the Nazi regime was occupying Paris and dominated Europe and North America. FDR personally wished to help Britain, but public opinion limited him. So really, the Axis powers had formed in 1940. We see elements of the Holocaust starting to take form, which by the end of the war in 1945 resulted in the mass extermination of millions of Jews and others in these Nazi death camps. But the full extent of the Holocaust would not be known until it was too late. What ultimately brings the US into war is the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Now, the last time the US had actually been invaded or attacked on US soil, if we think back, was back in the War of 1812. So this attack on Pearl Harbor was devastating. It was a date that would live on in infamy, as FDR said. Japanese planes launched from aircraft carriers and bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It killed more than 2,000 Americans, and quickly FDR asked for a declaration of war against Japan and the Axis powers, saying that they were aggressive and needed to be stopped. So immediately after, we see Congress overwhelmingly declare war, and Americans start to become more on board with this war. And you see in the poster, part of the propaganda for the war is from the Office of War Information, the OWI, showing 1778 during the American Revolution, and then another image of soldiers in 1943 saying Americans will always fight for liberty. So giving this an ideological meaning that America stands for freedom, and now it's the opportunity of Americans to extend that worldwide. So quickly on the home front, we see efforts by the federal government to mobilize for war. World War II really transformed the role of the national government. Federal workers rose from 1 to 4 million during the war. We see companies being forced to produce war goods. The government took more taxes from paychecks. By 1945, American taxes were at an all-time high. And really, overall, we're seeing a big need for big business in order to produce goods for the Allied forces. There is a tremendous effort on everyday activities being in the name of helping soldiers over in Europe. Roosevelt offered incentives to big businesses, low interest loans, tax concessions, contracts with guaranteed profits to try to up production. And Americans produced an astonishing amount of wartime goods, utilizing science and technology. And we really see the West Coast become a focus for military industrial production. And we see that has a long-standing effect on the growth of places like Los Angeles and Orange County. So nearly 2 million Americans moved to California for jobs in defense-related industries, whereas the South in the East remained very poor when the war ended. We also see the federal government employed to recognize unions. So organized labor entered a 3-sided arrangement with government and business that allowed union membership to soar to unprecedented levels. And unions became firmly established in many sectors of the economy during World War II. Again, because the need for labor was so tremendous that any kind of strike or protest on the part of the workers would really hamper or diminish the U.S. war production, which could eventually potentially mean, a loss for the Allied forces. So that was really important. Another really important thing was rationing. We see a lot of propaganda aimed at families starting victory gardens to grow their own vegetables, to save canned goods and commercially farmed agriculture to be saved and shipped to the people fighting abroad in the Pacific and in Europe. So rationing was a huge thing, not taking more than you needed. We'll see even in the styles, short cropped pants and things like that became sort of stylish, and it was sort of a way of flaunting your patriotism. We'll see this as a big clash when it comes to the Zoot Suit riots and the Zoot Suiters wearing these really long and baggy suits, sort of in the face of rationing. But the Office of War Information, the OWI, gave hope and an ideological meaning to the war. So they used radio, film, the press to sort of launch this people's fight for freedom against fascism and tyranny. So here's an example of one of the OWI posters, right? Walt Disney was helping out in this fight for freedom to sort of raise money, this concert that was going to raise money for the Allied forces. But then you had some of the darker images of this propaganda as well, using the words of Abraham Lincoln: "This world cannot exist half slave and half free. We have to fight for freedom," right? And we see the stake, the families are at stake against this kind of menacing, dark, sort of fascist ruler who has a whip in his hand. And then to look at the union membership and how it just rose tremendously from 1933, a little under 3 million members, to 1942, 10,000 members, sorry, 10 million members. By 1945, that's almost 15 million. Women also have a tremendous opportunity, and we see old constraints as well for them during the war. In 1944, women made up over 1/3 of the civilian labor force. And what's different about this time period for women working is that a lot of married women and mothers were also taking on these jobs. So new opportunities were opening up for women and mothers. They were being offered roles in male-dominated industries, partially because there was just a great need for labor. And with a lot of men going and serving abroad in the armed forces, women really sort of were needed to fill some of those spots. Women's work during the war was viewed by men and government as temporary. And a lot of men were very reluctant and displeased to see women in these male-dominated industries. So again, the OWI steps in to create this image that we see here of the Rosie the Riveter, right? Really transforming the construction of what it meant to be feminine. No longer is it high heels and dresses, it's rolling up your sleeves, getting to work, we can do it type of thing. So we see a tremendous shift from what is considered to be feminine and womanly. And the OWI and the federal government has a big hand in that shift. Women are also serving in auxiliary military roles, non-combat roles during the war. But again, all of these were seen as temporary. There was an expectation that once the war was over, everything would go back to a pre-war status. One of my favorite OWI posters is this image of a family. This is America, where the family is a sacred institution, where children love, honor, and respect their parents, and where a man's home is his castle. This is your America, keep it free. Right, so there's, again, this expectation that when the men return home, that the women will give up their jobs, return to being, full-time homemakers, and the patriarchal structure of America will return. American minorities at home and abroad during World War II. There's generally an expectation that World War II is creating this vast melting pot, especially for European immigrants and their children. Roosevelt promoted pluralism as the only source of harmony in a diverse society. And government and private agencies were eagerly promoting group equality as the definition of Americanism. And this is as a counterpoint to Nazism, where the master race theory and Nazi intolerance was being spread. So by the war's end, racism and nativism have been stripped of their intellectual respectability, and immigrants are being accepted as ethnic Americans. So this is a huge shift from what we see in the decades previous. Again, why we're sort of looking at World War II as this watershed event. But intolerance had hardly disappeared from American life. So ideologically, yes, racism, nativism is no longer acceptable, but that didn't mean society was changing their ideas altogether. For Mexican Americans, the Bracero program brought a lot of opportunities. So it lasted until 1964, and it started during the war as a program that allowed tens of thousands of contract laborers to cross the United States border to take up jobs as domestic and agricultural workers. So there's an encouragement to immigrate to the US, but they're being denied citizenship. But this led to a rise in second-generation Mexican Americans, and a new Chicano culture was forming, as evidenced by the Zoot Suiters and the Zoot Suit riots that occurred in 1943 that were sailors and police attacking these Mexican American youth, and really highlighted the overall intolerance that we see. So wartime intolerance kind of drew, and the Zoot Suit riots drew attention to the plight of Mexican Americans and made national headlines, which was huge. For Native Americans, we also see some interesting opportunities arise for their service in the Army. The Iroquois Nation declared war against the Axis powers as well, and we actually see the Navajo tribe using men to serve as code talkers, to really openly talk over radio signals and give wartime strategy, military strategy, with their native language, because it was so sacred and unknown, and couldn't be picked up on. So that was a big point of pride for Native Americans to be able to serve. We see a quick big change here from Lady Liberty welcoming all of these children of British, Italian, Polish, Irish, French descent, really again showing that ethnic Americans, well, white ethnic groups, were being openly accepted into as Americans. For Asian Americans, we see a bit of a change as well. For Chinese Americans and for Chinese immigrants, the Chinese Exclusion Act is finally abolished because China is an ally. That immigration law is overturned, and Chinese are seen as the quote-unquote good Asians. Japanese Americans, on the other hand, become the target. They are viewed as the detested foe because of the attack of Pearl Harbor. So the American government quickly after Pearl Harbor saw every person of Japanese descent as a potential spy. And Roosevelt quickly issues Executive Order 9066 that brought all firstborn and second generation Japanese Americans into internment camps, where they were put into isolation and kept away from the West Coast, where they could potentially be spying on the US government and reporting back to Japan. So this was one of the limits that we see to the war and to this sort of equality and accepting ideology. So internment really revealed how easily the war could undermine basic freedoms. Hardly anyone spoke out against internments. The courts refused to intervene until a lawsuit was issued against the US government, and it eventually made its way up to the Supreme Court. The Korematsu versus the United States challenged these internment camps as a violation of their basic American freedoms, their constitutional rights as American citizens. And the Supreme Court upheld the federal order, saying it was a war power, a protection of homeland security, and therefore necessary. So, despite Japanese Americans being interned, the government continued to market war bonds to them in these camps and drafted them into the army, even though they were being deprived of their basic rights. So a lot of contradictions when we see the treatment of Japanese Americans during the war. For African Americans in the wartime message of freedom was an opportunity to transform the status of being Black in the United States. The war spurred a movement of the Black population from the rural South to the cities of the North and the West. And very similar to the Great Migration that we see during World War I, there's a lot more job opportunities for African Americans in the city. As far as military service goes, during the war, over 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces. But Black soldiers were sometimes giving up their seats on railroad cars, forced to accommodate Nazi prisoners of war. They were also denied GI benefits after the war. But the African American community and the civil rights movement was birthed out of this World War II era, partially because of what the organization CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which formed in 1942, did, which was to sort of launch this campaign, a double V campaign, which meant victory over Germany and fascism, but also victory over segregation at home. And African American men were encouraged to participate and demonstrate their patriotism by serving in the war to sort of bring attention to the fact that they were deserving and equal. So we see a series of sit-ins in the North to try to integrate public and private settings. And what happens is, as a result of the war, is a lot of these veterans returned only to be lynched in the South. And the Southerners, white Southerners, reacted as a way to preserve white supremacy. So there's a huge reluctance to accept that African Americans would be equal, which again gave further fuel for the birth of the civil rights movement that we see in the 1950s really pick up. So World War II in general stimulated among African Americans a greater awareness of the links between racism in the United States and colonialism abroad. So here we have a map, that red line showing kind of where anybody living west of that red line that was of Japanese descent would be forced to go into an internment camp. The end of the war resulted in one of the most momentous decisions ever confronted by an American president, and that fell to Harry Truman. The Manhattan Project developed an atomic bomb, and Truman decided to make the controversial decision to drop it on Japan as a way of ending the war, and also as a way of retaliating for Pearl Harbor. So August 6, 1945, the US drops its first atomic weapon on Hiroshima, Japan. It destroyed the city, killed 70,000 immediately. The impact of the radiation had a tremendous impact on the people that lived. 3 days later, another bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, and soon after, Japan surrenders and the war is over. Before all of this, though, there had been plans for a post-war world. The United Nations had formed in 1944 as a way of trying to mitigate war and deter these kinds of violent conflict happening again. But overall, we see that most of Europe is really hurt from the war. Britain and France especially are weakened, and World War II results with the US becoming the world's dominant power, especially with the economic affluence that comes as a result of the war, and also the fact that it has this atomic weapon. It remained to be seen how seriously the various allies would react to the US having this sort of power. But what is quickly obvious is that the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe would be of a tremendous concern for the Allied Western European nations. and for the United States. There's a fear that they have their own atomic weapon, and the fact that they were such of ideological differing and had such different views on the world was quite concerning. And this is really what is going to spark the Cold War that follows World War II. So this is one of the images that we see following the Hiroshima bombing. This is the remains of a elementary school. There's nothing. It's rubbish. So really, really devastating for Japan.